Okay, Boker Tov, and welcome back. Today we're going to be exploring unknown territory for a lot of people as we explore the works of Ksav, Vehakabala, the writ and the tradition. Thank you, Dr. Yeager, this is the most recent printing in 2015. It's the most easy to access, but there's been multiple versions over the course of the last century and a half. We're going to learn a little bit about Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank Esther, Baruch, and Rochelle, who are sponsoring our learning today, as we just are marking the yard side, I believe, tonight. Wednesday night, coming up for Mr. David G. Weiss. That is Esther and Rochelle's father, Chaim Zev Ben Yoel, whose yard side will be coming up. And just a little bit of background, it always helps me appreciate it. Thank you, Esther, for sharing. Is Mr. Weiss, or Dave Weiss, was born in Hungary, and he was actually known in those days as Shandor Greenblatt. He was the oldest of four siblings, and after his bar mitzvah, his father was taken to a labor camp, and he began to have to take that role and help his mother out, and that was in the shop that they had, which was a tailor shop. And as the war progressed, they moved from their home. They had to go to a local ghetto. They were deported. And they were actually on a train which was heading to Auschwitz, but the tracks were blown up ahead of them. And with much muzzle, they were able to escape to Austria. And there were many detours and twists and turns, but he ended up in Mauthausen and was liberated from the camp. I think it's called Gunzgurchen. Afterwards, and his immediate family was remarkably survived the war. He came to America and became Dave Weiss, and because the papers he was able to come up with, and he became Dave Weiss from there onwards. In 1947, he married Mrs. Weiss and built a family in Forest Hills, and Baruch Hashem, their house is still there. And for many years of that, as a person, he was a person who was happy. He was loved by all who met him, and he had a Shem Tov, which is greater than all the other accomplishments, especially in the Garment Center and in the community. He was a proud father and always saw the glass half full. He would always say that he came off the boat with $7 and was given to him by the HIAS, right? And anything he had in life was profit and a gift. Imagine we lived life that way. And Nishmas Ed and his neshama should have an aliyah. Let us take a moment to learn for his aliyah's neshama. Let's learn a little bit about really a fascinating individual who I've been intrigued with for so many years. You know why? Because I share a name with him. So the Ksav Vehakabala is Rav Yaakov Tzvi of Mecklenburg, and I've been slowly cultivating a club of all the Yaakov Tzvis around. It happens to be we have a few in our shul, just in case you're wondering. So Kovi Pan is a Yaakov Tzvi, and also it happens to be that Jacob Meil is a Yaakov Tzvi Yisrael, and the reason is because his great-grandfather, that's Nissa Meil's father of blessed memory, was also Yaakov Tzvi. And it turned out that I always would say that the head of the club is the Ksav Vehakabala, right? Because Mecklenburg. But I didn't realize until 2013 that there was another one as well. And that was, when it came to 2013, we were able, in our shul, 2014, we were the first shul in the 5 towns at that time to host the chief rabbi, then who had just retired of England, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And Kovi Pan was the gabbai who called him up. And he called him up as Yaakov Tzvi. And that was a very exciting moment because the Jonathan was just a red herring then, and Kovi immediately realized that there was a new member of the club, and it was very exciting. So the Yaakov Tzvi Club is a very special club, and I tried to find out a little appreciation of namesakes. So let's start at the very beginning. Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg was born in Lissa, and this in 1785. And he passed away in 1665. So he lived to the age of 80. It was a province. Lissa is a province in Germany, in Posen in Germany. Remember, at the time that he's born, Germany is not a country, but it's really just a lot of duchesses, a lot of different areas. And ultimately, he does not travel far. So he spends his life growing up. He spends his first 45 years. He's educated by some of the great Torah teachers of the times. But he goes into business. He does not believe he should be getting his parnasa from Klei Kodesh, and he, till the age of 45 years old, works in business. At the same time, keeping up his very assiduous Torah study regimen. At the age of 45, 46, he is asked by the Kohen community of Königsberg to become the rabbi there, and that's what he does till his death. So he serves there for the next 30 or so years as the rabbi of Königsberg. Königsberg at this time is actually, if you look at the map on the bottom of the first page, this is really not so far. So Posen is where the little 8 is on the right-hand side of the bottom. We'll call Eastern Germany. And Königsberg is the city on the Baltic Sea. It was a port city up to the north, top right. So really not a significant amount of travel. So he lived within Germanic provinces. Königsberg itself had an interesting history. It kept on, it was East Prussia, technically speaking, and it became Russian at a certain point, and then kept on going backwards and forwards. So any border cities or port cities had this complexity. Of course, the milieu of the times is similar to Rav Hirsch, so that's why we're going to examine his ideas, his writings. It's different yet similar to the writings of Rav Hirsch. The tone in the air right now is enlightenment. The reform movement is in full swing by the time he's taking his seat in the rabbinate, and therefore his writings reflect that type of complexity, that type of difficulty that he's facing as well. It's worthwhile noting that his teacher, the teacher who he quotes many people by name. But his teacher, as he quotes, if you take a look at the first source in the third line there, he says, "Sha'alti SP Adoni Mori V'Rabbi Hagoyim Rabbi Akiva Eiger." So his teacher was no less than Rabbi Akiva Eiger of blessed memory, one of the great halachicists, one of the great leaders of the diaspora community. That was who he learnt from. Just to get a sense of what we're talking about over here, he wrote a number of svarim, and he wrote a book called the Iyonat Tefillah, which was a commentary on the Siddur. And he wrote his Shtapchut HaNefesh, which is about a explanation of the Vidui on the Confession on Yom Kippur, but hands down his greatest commentary, the greatest magnum opus that he created was Ksav Vehakabala, which is his commentary on the Torah itself. And he spent an incredible amount of time. He had 2 editions published in his lifetime. And in fact, he wrote a second introduction the second time it was printed. Very, very fascinating commentary. He wrote it in Hebrew, unlike Rav Hirsch. Rav Hirsch wrote in German. He wrote in Hebrew, although it's peppered with German words, because to explain it, he leans upon German writings. In fact, the second edition was printed in a German translated Chumash with Rashi and Onkelos and the Ksav Vehakabala as well. The reason why we don't see it on the sides of every Mikra Ois Gedolos is because it's very long. It's very long. So his periods, this is just the first half. Okay, so he writes extensively, and he doesn't leave any I's undotted when it comes to his explanation, so it doesn't fit onto the page, which is perhaps why it's become, people know of it less, unfortunately, but we're going to appreciate some of the ideas that he describes. First of all, on the title page, let's just take a look at one of the things he makes the observation about. He says on his title page, on the bottom of page 2, source 2, he says, Omar Yakotzi ben Rabbi Gamliel Mecklenburg, Ra'isi kitov losum es advarim abayim bazeh befirosh Torah. I thought it's really important to write the ideas that I'm about to express in my commentary on the Torah. Ki'ilu hi tisa amram al sefoseva tashmiya kola barabim. So it should bear their ideas. So I'm trying to make the Torah the vehicle for expressing the ideas I'm about to explain. Lo'idi'ah livnei adam, to teach human beings. Al ma ze mat'im heim dvaria ad ma'od b'mechtava bal yevuaru bilti im hanimsar mipeh le'ozen chachmei dor vador. I wanted to be very clear that people do not make the mistake of abrogating or separating the tradition that we have with the writing that we have. Meaning, I want to show how the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, is connected very much to the written Torah, and that is what his goal is. In fact, he makes note in his introduction, in his first introduction, because remember, the second edition has a second introduction. But if you flip the page where he describes, starting in the second paragraph, he says, "Pa'am," he says, "milemiut yadi aseinu." Sometimes, to the lack of our knowledge, yedume, it seems, ki'ilu ha-Kabbalah, the oral tradition, titain migra'as min Ksav. It seems sometimes that the oral tradition is deficient, is missing what is being said in the pasuk. And similarly, in the third paragraph, he says, "Upa'am," and sometimes yisgaleh lechalushei ra'ois kamoinu. Sometimes to the impoverishment or the weakness of our eyes. So again, it's all our deficiencies, not the Torah's deficiencies, which is precise the opposite of what's being said around him. Ki'ilu Vehakabala soseres es Ksav. That the oral law, in fact, is at odds with the written law. And therefore he says in the last paragraph, Ve'en bi'adeinu echad min ha'mechabrim. I don't see many of the authors, that refers to the people who he has at his disposal writing on the Torah, skipping the line, Asher beperusho yava'er is elanu hishtavus v'is achdus pshutei mikra'os ki'ilu Ka'ele im das rabosenu ba'alei halimud. La'askim datei Torah Ksav ha'idus ha'chukim yishvatim b'derech ma'alech pshat. Miyusad al amudei halashon asher ya'us lahem im Torah habhe. So I don't see anybody who's writing to create the analogous, to create the bridge between the oral law and the written law, which of course is why his commentary is called Ksav Vehakabala. So now we understand what he means. The Ksav is what I'm saying. The Ksav is the written word, and the Kabbalah is the tradition, and Ksav Vehakabala is putting the two together. By the way, everybody in the 19th century is doing the same thing. Rav Hirsch is doing the same thing. The Malbim is doing the same thing. Rav David C. Hoffman is doing the same thing. The Shadal is doing the same thing. The Malbim is going to be doing the same thing. This is the rage. Why? Because the real rage is happening outside, which is where the Torah Shebaal Peh is being rejected. And so he's doing this. Interestingly enough, he's doing it at the same time, which means to say he does not have at his disposal Rav Hirsch. Right? And he does not have the Malbim, who lives slightly later than him. So he is doing it uniquely, but doing the same thing, but from a different angle. Yes, Baruch.
At the same time, the Torah Tamima?
Oh, Torah Tamima is much later. So the Torah Tamima is also doing the same thing. Right? That's what I meant to think about. The Torah Tamima is doing it. But now the Torah Tamima is doing it from a different angle. The Torah Tamima is actually going to live at the end of the 19th century. He's the son of Yechiel Michal Epstein. So Baruch Epstein is the Torah Tamima, the Baruch She'amar. And his idea is, if you read his introduction, perhaps we'll do a week on him, is he wants to put the Torah Shebaal Peh and the Torah Ksav on the same page. His goal is not to synthesize. His goal is not to explain the bridge. He is actually on his own creative genius pathway, and he's doing his own thing. But over here, Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg is trying to say, how do the two work? Right? How is this? How would, if you really understood this, would you arrive at the conclusions Chazal made? That's what his. By the way, he calls that Pshutoi Shel Mikra. Okay, so as opposed to, let's say you were to interview the Rashbam or the Ibn Ezra and ask them, what do you think Pshuto Shel Mikra is? They would say, listen, clear the table, look at the text and see what it says. The Ksav Vehakabala says, what do Chazal say? And now understand how that is what the Torah actually means.
It's like reconciling. Okay.
Completely reconciling as well. So it all comes together, and he does so with incredible, we'll call it intellectual integrity. We're going to see a few examples in a moment. Just to appreciate this, he's living in a time where there's a lot of complexity. So just want to quote two episodes that occurred. He was once, when he was in Königsberg, he lived very much al pi din, as we just saw in his introduction here. He lives very much by Jewish law. And once he was asked to marry a couple, and the family was not an observant couple. So he actually, generally speaking, refused to officiate at weddings that people were no longer keeping Torah mitzvahs, which is a pretty strong standard, not so simple, because you never know, where it's going to end, how that works. But he was asked finally by this person went to the authorities, who obligated him to officiate the wedding, because in those days, remember that it was actually that particular province that paid the rabbi, right? So it was the government was in charge of what we call the religious department. So they went to the authorities and said, he's not doing his job marrying my kids, right? So he went up there, and when he gave the suggestion to the chassan, or the words to the chassan, he said, read after me. Frederick the Great. He refused to marry them Kedas Moshe Yisrael because they weren't keeping Das Moshe Yisrael, right? So meaning to say he wasn't willing to compromise when it came to these things as well. In a letter he wrote to Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, the Rav of Graditz, he says, and this is a translation of one of his letters, he says, the Rav's great desire to see my work on the Torah is, in my opinion, inappropriate, for it is not intended for a Gaon such as himself, but for the people of lesser stature, for it seeks to repair the breach of ungodliness that had the audacity to ascribe falsehood to our teachers, the sages, the Oral. I thank God that this explanation pleased our brothers in Poland and Russia, And he goes on to say how he appreciates this, but he says it's not for the likes of you. Now, folks, halavai, we could understand what he was saying. We'll see in a moment that he wasn't playing games, but he was very humble about the way he saw things, and he didn't believe that what he was doing was an incredible work of art. He was very, very humble about the way he looked at things. It should also be known that towards the end of his life, he started losing his eyesight, so he really struggled with that as well. You can see it in his letters. There are still letters which are preserved. So he really struggled physically, but this was his contribution in a significant way to the history of Klal Yisrael. Let's look at a few examples of what he's doing. So even in the name of the Sefer, he multiple times throughout the Torah, he goes back and he references why he called this book his book. So for instance, very famously, the Torah tells us that if a person will harm another person, the Torah says, ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein, right? It says, kviyah tachas kviyah, petza tachas petza. The Torah tells us that like you did unto the others will be done upon yourself. And so, obviously, this is one of the very clear divergent places where Chazal tells us, the Gemara in Baba Kama tells us in Perek HaChovel that this refers to monetary compensation. However, if you read the Torah itself, it sounds like this is some form of barbaric, Neanderthal, practice of justice, where you chop off the hands. Some religions still do this, and not to mention religions of peace. At this, in this context, but nonetheless, this is what the Torah says. So how do we synthesize this? And as well, and he says in the beginning of source 4, the second paragraph, he says, "Nearly bi'arab psukim b'derech hakarov el apshat ba'oven shiaskim alashon." I would like to make sure that this passage can be read both by the way you read the actual words and by the way which is called has the moral integrity of what we understand is logical, and the Kabbalah, which is Chazal. Right? That's a tall order, right? And so he goes on in the first paragraph to explain that the pasuk begins v'ish ki yiten mu b'abisoi kasher yiten keni nosen boy. It says v'ish. Why does it start with the word vav? Right? Why does the pasuk start with the letter vav? He goes on to give a whole explanation of the letter vav, and then at the top of the fourth page he says in the second line, kain ois vav. You see that towards the end of the second line, kain ois vav shebemilas v'ish kan pirush kamoi. Kain, kamoi kain, meaning the word vav doesn't mean and, it means such, like. Right, therefore he says, what's the previous pasuk? Ki acharesha amar ma kain nefesh behema yeshal mena amachara veish ki yitain mun b'misoi. So meaning, what's the previous pasuk? The previous pasuk says that if you harm an animal, then you will pay for it because it's seen as a financial damage. Veish ki yitain mun b'misoi kasher yitain kain nosen boy. That means to say is now we understand that when the Torah describes this, it's referring and such like we describe by an animal, that would be a financial responsibility. Similarly over here as well, which means you just haven't read the pasuk carefully enough if you came to the conclusion this is referring to physical damage as well. By the way, you see in the parentheses, that's where he adds in the German. Not going to go into that. He says, Rotzelamar kumosh b'makeh nefesh b'ema yesh tashlomim kacha hadin b'ish ki yitaimun b'misoi v'acharesh omar b'derech klal she'achol b'chaver yidmem b'makeh nefesh b'ema sheb'shneim yischayev tashlomim. And just like now we've said categorically, when you harm a human being, you pay financial damages. You don't take off their ear, right? Then hoisiv levaer b'derech pratei geder v'ofen tashlomei hamum. And then he goes on to describe some of the details as well. And that's why he says the very last paragraph, V'advarim kravim el apshat, uvozeh eina Ksav Vehakabala sosrim zeh. Says according to, if you read this carefully, then the Ksav Vehakabala do not contradict each other. And that's the goal. That's what he's trying to do all the time. So whenever there seems to be a divergence, he's trying to explain how the Ksav Vehakabala come together. That's his goal, and he does this throughout the Torah as well. In doing this, he, like Rav Hirsch, is very careful about language. So as opposed to, let's say, the earlier Rishonim, who are much more flexible when it comes to understanding the language of the Torah, he is very precise. Rav Hirsch does this, the Malbim does this. There's a lot of precision, because remember, into imprecision that's where steps all the criticism, all the satirists, all the enlightened movements. So as an example, we just learned this in Parshas Toldos in source 5. We're told, so So he quotes the Mitzudos, who says, Minhag HaNevuos, this is a comment which the Radak will say, the Ibn Ezra will say. This phrase comes up so many times in the Mefarshim, in the early Mefarshim. What it is? Minhag HaNevuos lachpil ha'inyan b'milos shonos. The way of the text is to double up something in different language, which means don't get so excited, don't get so anxious about the fact that there are different words used. It's poetic. The way of the Torah is to say the same thing multiple times in different ways, right? But don't give so much worry about this as well. That's what it said. That's what, and so therefore the Radak will say this multiple times. You'll see Ibn Ezra say this all the time. Don't get so excited about doublings. And then he says, but he goes on 2 lines later to say, that's not very grand. That's not very appropriate for the Hebrew language. That you just have, interchangeable words, or you just thesaurus them, and like, okay, we'll put whatever we want. That it sounds very arbitrary to understand Hebrew like that. And he says the following. He says, "V'nei motzanu goy va'am ulu'um kulam morim al ribu ishim." That the words goy, am, and lu'um, again, translate them and you've lost, because they don't really. He says it talks about a lot of people, right? But they mean different things. So he points out that the word goy talks about a lot of people without any leadership. So when you talk about a goy, it refers to a multitude, but there's no connection between them. There's no ruling or governance. It's just a lot of people. Whereas refers to a group of people who are under somebody's jurisdiction. So for instance, Mordechai, he points out as an example. Another example he uses is Hashem Elokai, right? Hashem Eile, right? So this is referring to actually the nation of Israel when they were kicked out of Israel. So and he says you wouldn't say Goy Mordechai or Goy Pliny, because Goy doesn't have a leader at the top of it. Then he points out that the word Le'om at the end, Morem Malchus, actually refers not just to there being a leader, but to being a dominion as well. So again, everything he does in the Torah is with great precision. And so therefore you need to understand what is the Torah saying and why is it saying it multiple times in different ways, because each way actually has relevance. Okay? Good. Exactly. That's why perhaps it uses that at the beginning of Yeshayahu. Right?
That would not fit, by the way.
Interesting. No, but that's the point.
Exactly.
That's exactly the point. At that point that we have not yet arrived at having. Very good. Very good.
It doesn't quite fit because Mitzrayim was a goy, was a nation with a land. So it's.
Yeah, what do I have to do? So the homework is to go look at that pasuk in the Ksav Vehakabala.
Consistency of it,
It's over. You have to go through. But nonetheless, his point over here is that everything is precise. We're going to see this knowledge. Now, that's going to take a lot of work. We'll see what the Malbim does to try to explain this. The Malbim actually is going to set out 613 rules of language to appreciate this. We'll get there next week. But when it comes to the Ksav Vehakabala, everything has to be precise. We're not going into the early Rishonim, which is this poetic look at things. It's very much more sensitive. Similarly, he's sensitive to cantillation as well. So many times what he'll do is he'll quote a Mefarish, and he quotes people by name, except when he tries to dismiss them. He doesn't like to embarrass people. Wow, it's amazing. How would he survive on Twitter today, right? Today, the only thing you do is basically you can make an entire career just dismissing other people and making fun of them. Well, so the way when he dismissed people, generally speaking, he would not do it by name. But he talks about an errant view of this pasuk, which describes lo tizra karmecha kilayim pekdidash hamelea zera shetizra utvas hakarim, and he quotes some errant interpretation that it's referring to not planting certain things in a vineyard because maybe there's going to be an interchange of dew, and that will allow them to become tameh. And he points out that why would the Torah make a geder like that if there's no issur on making tum in the first place? And then his capstone rejection of this is at the very last line, where he says, the second last line, he says, Gam dvarov milois, pentigdash meleah, mechubarim, yachad, according to this interpretation, this person, he calls the Igras Yosher, I'm not sure who that is. Besides the fact that it's not correct in the logic of the pasuk, he says his way of reading this pasuk would put two words together, which are pentigdash hamleah, right? And he says, but they're actually separate based on the cantillation. Ukvar Omar Avram ben Ezra, kol pirush she'ena maskim im neginas hatam lo tovev lo tishma elav. says if it doesn't work with the cantillation, then it's automatically incorrect. And he says there's clearly a mafsik there, right? Pen tikdash hamleya zera asher tizra. So therefore, tikdash is separate from the word milea, and the interpretation that he's rejecting in this particular case has connected the two. And he says simply the actual cantillation, not only the words, just the way it is read seems to be against the way, which means to say, by the way, if you go back to the Gemara in Nedarim, which describes all the things, actually forget the word Gemara in Nedarim, going back to the pasuk in Ezra, in Nehemiah, it's really Ezra, that describes V'sum Seichel, that it describes how Ezra read the Torah with all these traditions from Sinai. One of the traditions was cantillation. So again, it has to all fit. It has to all fit. You can't suddenly just sit there, clear the desk, and when you clear the desk, you took away some of the significant things. Which means, what do the words mean? How is it read? These are part of the package as well. A big push for the Baalei Kriya over here. Now he goes on to describe a lot of his war. Although he doesn't spend all his time doing this, but there's a lot of time where he talks about hamis chakmim. Those people, like the word chacham means wise, right? Mischakmim is they make themselves wise, right? So you can hear the satire, right? The satire is the mitchakmim. He says that refers to usually the enlightened folks who are reinterpreting the Torah as well. So in this regard, he has a very classic, this is a very, very important perspective. He says in source 8, the second line he says, if Israel does shuvah, then they will come back to me and they will never leave. He says, and you will do all the mitzvahs which I do today. Hashem will not change religion. Hashem doesn't change the law. So he quotes Rav Luria, who's Lutzato, I apologize. Lemofeis barur v'choisech im haTorah atzmin haTorah atzmoi ki lo bilvad shloi kotzvo haTorah zman lhafsek g'chovas haguf elo gam she'omro b'ferush hamakois hashmiyos lo yifsaku la'olam v'sha'af lo asilo v'yishaer chiyuvo aleinu lezarenu ad olam. The responsibility is what he calls the chovas haguf. The mitzvahs do not stop at any arbitrary moment in Jewish history. It's not like, now, because of circumstance, because of our enlightenment, because of our understanding, because of the context, we no longer have to do this. He's saying even after Geula, there'll still be mitzvahs. Which means to say is, we haven't reached Geula yet, so how can you possibly say that we can negotiate some of these things because it doesn't fit with your new moral compass because you just stepped out of the ghetto yesterday? Right, so that's his argument. In fact, it relates very much to I'll call it a worldview. In fact, as well, which is that in Reform they don't have synagogues; they have temples. And in a certain sense, ideologically, what a temple is not the Mikdash Ma'at, it's the Mikdash, right? Meaning it's almost as if we've arrived. This is where we need and should be, right? This is it. This is where God wants us to be because, yesteryear, that antiquated nonsense and mishmash, that's not us, right? We know, we're in the most enlightened Western country, right? This is our temple, this is where we are. He's pointing out things don't change. We're not arrived, first of all. And number two, we haven't done Shiva. And number three is things won't change even when we get there. So just understand the humility of this as well. By the way, I was just chatting because yesterday we celebrated Shea Rachas with the Blumenthals, which was wonderful. The Blumenthals are a very German family, right? And he told me a joke. How did it go? He said so he was talking about how his parents. Dr. Blumenthal was telling me that his parents lived in Washington Heights, Maine. And they when they this is the real community, this is how it works. And they introduced a timer for their lights, right? And so he was explaining to his parents, it's new technology. Now you can have the lights on to a certain time. You don't have and it was great. And she said she really didn't like it. He says, why? He says, because I had to stay up and use the light till 10 o'clock. right? Baruch Hashem, everything has to be. There's a way that things should be. So I was speaking to him yesterday, and he pointed out that most German Jews weren't in Germany. Meaning, after most of German Jewry was wiped out, the real German Jews left. The German Jews today are those who came back from DP camps and from Eastern Europe and so on. It's not the real McCoy of the ancient Germans. The real Germans left as well. So it's just like the irony of calling your place a temple, saying you've arrived in a place that completely obliterates and destroys everything that last remaining past vestige of Judaism. So it's a limud for us all as well. What he does as well, like the Malbim, but not like Rav Hirsch, is he's also very involved in Kabbalistic thought as well. So he'll say this many, many times. Look at how he words it. This is an example where he talks about in Parshas Kisis of the Jews the Israelites removing Edyom, their crowns from them. He says in source 9, Uma na'ama, and how beautiful is it, Militzas Rabboseinu, that the teachings of our teachers, Ba'amram ba'mechilta de Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. What's that? Zohar. The Zohar. Okay, so he calls the Zohar the teachings of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And he goes and he describes he describes that's referring to their phylacteries, their tefillin just being taken off. He will do this. He'll quote Meshur no less than 400 times throughout the commentary on the Torah, which is fascinating, right? So, as much as you say you think you can, circumscribe him as being, a technical word analyst trying to fit Chazal, he's not limited. He's a ish ashkalos. He has success and erudition in all elements of Torah. Just as an example, and we're not going to go through this, but just if you look at this next source in source 10, where he goes through B'tzumis Yad or Asek, he starts with the Gemara in Bab Metzia. Then he moves down, then he says, this is how I explain it according to Rashi. In the fourth line, he goes and he quotes Tosas. Then he goes and he quotes in the sixth line, the Pnei Yoshua. Then moving down, he says, this actually disagrees with the Chidushei Ramban, which is born in the Shittu Mukubetzas. Then he quotes the Afla. You understand that he's not a, sometimes, there's different departments of Judaism. There's the halachic department, the Gemara department, right? And then there is the Mefarshim department, and they're the ones who speak on the Torah, but they usually are not necessarily the same department. So, for instance, Ibn Ezra was not a halachicist. Ibn Ezra spent his time explaining the Torah and ideas and philosophy and poetry. Wonderful. But he was not a halachicist, right? Rabbeinu Tam, for the most part, was a halachicist. He lived in these are different departments. It's fascinating. Remember when we learned the interaction between them a few weeks ago, right? When Ibn Ezra and the Rabbeinu Tam conversed with each other. But he over here is a person who's in both camps. Right? Just to understand this, he is in the Kabbalistic camp. He's in the linguistic camp. He is in the phonetic camp. He's etymological camp. He's living in all these spaces. So this is a person you can learn an incredible amount from, not just in one space as well. One of the things that is important about the hallmark of his a few pieces over here that are related to the ideas that he's trying to espouse are the ideas that he defends the greats. What does that mean? Is that unlike what's going on, where there's higher and lower criticism which is emerging in the 19th century, higher criticism of the Bible, lower criticism of the sages, and it comes out from a deep-seated sort of anti-establishment assessment. We can't trust. We can't give value to that which we are told in the past because we're discovering things which undermine all of that, and this is happening in every department, right? So the enterprise or the establishment has told us that the world is so old. Well, we've found fossils that show that it's older in carbon dating. The establishment tells us that there was creation. Well, there's this thing called evolution. This is all being discovered at the same time. Well, we're told that there's the biblical author is God is the deity. Well, technically speaking, there's 4 different versions of the styles in the Bible. Right? Everything is being criticized. That's the war that's happening right now. And Judaism, that's been now exposed to this, is very comfortable just sort of jumping across the aisle to that. And Judaism and many Jews actually join much of the criticism as well. And so a lot of that criticism is levied not just against the Torah, but those who live in the Torah as well. So therefore there's an incredible amount of deference which is being straddled. Remember that last time we learned, when we looked at Rav Hirsch was willing to actually allow there to be a human perspective on the greats. So Rav Hirsch pointed out that Yitzhak and Rivka were incorrect in their educational process of Yaakov and Esav. That's a big statement. the Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the Ksav is not going to go that way. He will always give the greatest. He will not open up a breach or even a fracture in the way that he looks at the grades. So, for instance, you're going to have to deal with some very difficult things. So, when it comes to Rivka, why is Rivka tricking her husband? Why is Rivka telling her son to lie? Right? This is an educational problem. People always say this: "I left the lights in the house. Can I just tell my child to do this?" Like, forget the lights. That's a really big educational problem if you just show that it doesn't really matter to you, these kind of things. You're setting them up for a life of failure. If you're going to spend your Shabbos table criticizing the rabbis at school and in administration, you're going to have children who are going to think that about them as well. So just be careful what you say about them. So how could Rivka be educating her son to lie to her father, to her husband? Right? That's a really bad thing. Right? So it doesn't work. So he says the following. He says very simple. She had the prophecy when she had twins in utero, and she was told Ki Rav Yavod Sa'ir, that the older one will serve the younger one. She knows that to be true. And his assumption at this point in time is that was a prophecy given specifically to her as the mother. And Yitzhak either didn't know or wasn't willing to know. But he's going with didn't know. Okay? Rav Hirsch actually goes in a different perspective. Rav Hirsch diverges here and says she tried to convince him, but he wouldn't. He couldn't. Right? He understands that this is a prophecy given specifically to Rivka, and therefore the way he says it is she knows. And look at the third line. In the middle of the line, he says, "Hinei hi yada beveirur gamur shebir chasoi le'esav einenu lefi ratzon Hashem." She knows the blessings are not God's will to give to Esav. So she knows what Yitzhak is trying to do is not what the divine will wants to orchestrate. So she has to facilitate that Yitzhak does the right thing. And the way he gives an explanation, like a mashal for it later on, is he describes that let's say you have a blind person who is walking through an area which is dangerous, which is bad, which is going to be to their detriment. So what you'll have to sometimes do is you'll have to facilitate that they turn a little bit, they don't go across that, they're not going to step in that, they're not going to put their foot on that, right? And sometimes you have to do that so respectfully because you don't want to embarrass them or make them feel like they are a fool. So you do it in a way that, oh, come hold my hand, you sort of take them in that direction. And that was what Rivka was doing. And Yitzhak was not just blind physically, she was saying he was also blind to God's will in this particular case, which she knew because she had the prophecy. And therefore it was the only correct path or course of action which she was doing as well. Again, trying to defend what otherwise would be not an educational philosophy which we would adopt ourselves similarly. Similarly with Yosef and the brothers. So, I don't know, everybody has sibling rivalry, but most people don't try to kill their siblings, right? So, is that the kind of thing that we're supposed to be, educating our children to do? So, he points out that if based on the words that it says, Vaisnaklu Echov, that his brothers conspired, what does it mean when they see him coming? It says that they were concerned, they didn't know, is this person for real, right? Is when he kept on telling us these dreams, is that he really believes that, or is that something that it's actually just he's making it up as he goes along? He's making it up as he goes along. Says the Vehakabala. They said, let's make it like we're going to kill him. Let's pretend that we're going to come against him violently, and then we'll see the truth. We'll see, is he going to stand up for what he's been telling us, the nonsense he's been staying for, or he's going to let the mask drop and show that this was all teenage power plays that he was playing with dad to tell him these kind of dreams. So Vaisnaklu Echov Le'argam means to say the intent was never to kill him, but to scare him as if they were going to kill him, because they wanted to see is he actually for real when it comes to this as well. So again, that doesn't give an excuse for this kind of behavior. Meaning, but at the same time, there was never the intent, as we said, as perhaps we would have understood in this way. Similarly, very much like many of the Mefarshim at this time, remember we saw Rav Hirsch struggling with this, but he also struggles with anthropomorphisms, because again, in a funny sense, his concern with anthropomorphism is not just the halachic concern, which is that, as the Rambam says, you're going to lose your chelik in Olam Haba if you believe God is a picture, like the Christians do, but it's also like you're diminishing God, right? You're diminishing God by putting him onto a page. Reminds me of this the story that there's little Susie's in the 4-year-old kindergarten. She's busy drawing a picture, and that's the real name in the story. I'm joking. and every time the Mora comes around, little Susie covers up her picture, and so she says, "Susie dear, what are you drawing?" She looks around and she says, "I am drawing God." She says, "Susie, no one knows what God looks like." She says, "In a few minutes they will." So, how do we understand about anthropomorphisms? So the Torah does this a number of times. Here's an example of how he deals with it in a very unique way, which still fits the text. So this is a very famous pasuk, which is very, very hard to understand at the end of Parshas Mishpatim. The Torah tells us, "Vayir'u es Elokei Yisrael." They saw the God of Israel. Betachas raglav, and under his feet, k'maasei livnas sapir, is like the sapphire firmament, ke'etzem hashamayim latohar, like the very sky, the shininess or the transparency of the sky for in purity. This is describing at Matan Torah. Remember, Matan Torah is described a few times, so it's described in Parshas Yisro, but the addendum is at the end of Parshas Mishpatim. And whether it happens before, during, or simultaneously is a machlokes harishonim as to how to understand Perek Chav Dalet in Sefer Shmos, which is where this is. But nonetheless, it sounds like they're seeing something of God. And if you read the continuing psukim, like Rashi understands them, it sounds like they were punished. Because Vayachlu Yishtu, they looked at it in a very gallant or very inappropriate way, and in fact some actually link this to being part of Nadav and Avihu's punishment, meaning they were at the higher levels of the mountain because there was different tiers of who reached where, and they were looking at what they shouldn't be looking at in an inappropriate way. He's saying is like, does God sit on a blue throne? Like is that what it's saying over here? Tachas raglov kama sapir, and he says the following. Look in the top of page 9. He says the following. He says, "Tachas raglov kamaaseh v'chuloi lulei yoresi hayisi omer shena dvarim ha'ele musabim alav yisparach." If I weren't scared, I would suggest that we misread the pasuk. They're not referring to God. Hamiromam mikol ofanei agshama beli tachlis. God is above any form of anthropomorphism, any attribution of human body parts. Omnam kol ha'ma'amar hazeh hamusav al anashim hanichbadim ha'ele asher zachu lemareh ha'elokis, which means to say, is that the people who are watching this episode, the people who are experiencing, experience is a better word than watching, because remember, the senses are converging at this point in time, right? They're hearing what's seen and they're seeing what's heard. So there's this convergence of senses because now we're actually moving towards another dimension, right? As Harisina is happening, physical boundaries are melting together, right? So at this point in time, he points out that a human being is made up of a body and a soul, right? A body and a soul which are sewn together. And his observation is that may be the case, but then to the degree that my soul has been elevated, therefore my tachtis, my lower part, which is my body, is going to have a higher capacity of experience, of being able to see things, because it's no longer weighting me down in a very gross way, right? Meaning it's kind of like taking, the garbage collection man and taking him to the Met, Lahavdil. And you say, "What do you see here?" And he's like, "The floors aren't clean." That's kind of, so if you've reached a higher level of spiritual elevation, even your body can see higher, otherwise you're just going to remain the boor who can't see things. So he's saying, the people watching, Tachas Raglav, meaning to say, is referring to the people's body. Their own conception now became purer in understanding the godly ideas and concepts because of the experience of Sinai. Raglav no longer refers to God, but the observers of this experience, or the experiences of the experience. He goes on to give it in great detail as well. He also he spends a lot of time giving fullness to the Torah text. So people will say the Torah is, doesn't seem to say everything. As an example, is a very famous one. In the fourth parak of Bereshis, where it describes Vayom Kain el Hevel Echav Achiv Vayhi b'Yosam Basadeh Vayokom Kain el Hevel Achiv Vayehargeu. So Kain says to Hevel, and they're in the field, and then he goes up and kills him. And I always wondered, and everybody wonders, what did he say to him? Do you notice that? It says, and he said to him, they were in the field, and he killed him. So Rashi tries to fill in, all the Mepharshim try to fill in. It sounds like the Torah kind of somebody pressed enter, right? And then just carried on going, a phrase disappeared. And that's what the critics will say. You see over here. So Chas Shalom, he says, El hevel achiv b'shvil echav, about his brother. Al ma shenishal lama chara lach v'lama naflu panecha al zeh heshiv kayin v'amar sheb'shvil hevel achiv chara loy v'naflu einav. No, or not naflu panav. Hashem had just asked in the previous pasuk is, Kayin, why are you so upset? What's bothering you so much? Comes the pasuk and says, Vayimer Kayin el hevel achiv. He's responding to Hashem, who says, it's hevel that's bothering me. El isn't, I'm speaking to him, but I'm speaking about him in explaining myself to Hashem. Right? So just a little bit better understanding of the text will help us understand that the text is not missing. What's missing is our punctuation. We don't have the capacity to read this correctly to understand this. Again, what is he doing? He's explaining that if you read things more carefully, you'll see the greater perspective over here. I'm going to skip the making of man. And I just don't know, I'll conclude just with one Dvar Torah, which always from him, which I thought always to me was very meaningful. It looks like to me that I skipped the printing of the last 3 pages, so I'll spare you. But I just want to end with one last perspective, and that is the Torah tells us in Parshas Kisisa, in Shmos Lamed Aleph, that the Torah says, "Shabbos Osai Tishmor, you shall keep my Sabbaths." How many Sabbaths are there exactly? Is that referring to the sum total of Sabbaths in my life? Is that the sum total of Sabbaths in all of creation? Like, it would be easier just to say, keep Shabbos, meaning, and therefore Shabbos is singular. Why is it my Sabbaths? And he says the following. He says, Ba lashon yachid al rabim. Why is it the singular expressed in plural? Ki tam shabsosai ba'avur ki shabosois hashana heim rabim. The Ramban says, because there's many in a year. Ulefi hamavuar, and according to what I understand, b'shem Shabbos sheyesh pi shnayim b'harasai. The word Shabbos itself includes 2. Ha'echad inyan habitul v'avsakam melacha, v'hasheni inyan yishuv hadas l'inyanim elokiyim. The first is cessation from physical labor, and the second is reorientation, idea of our spiritual compass. Im kain yesh b'chol Shabbos u'Shabbos shnei shvisos. Every singular Shabbos has 2 sets of rest. Shvisas aguf me'iske olam, v'shvisas v'yishuv ha'nefesh lisasek binyanim ruchanim elokiyim. V'shvisas aguf levado ikar v'tachlis kiyum asay t'shvisas Shabbos ki amnon ein rak siba goremes el shvisas v'yishuv hadas ha'nefesh. I remember somebody once asked a young girl who was on a process on the way back to finding Judaism, and he said, "What do you think about Shabbos?" There's a first like NCSY Shabbaton, and she says, "I heard that Shabbos is all about like not cutting toilet paper." And he said, "Yeah, you're right. What we do is, in Orthodox circles, is every Sabbath we put a roll of toilet paper and we sit around it, and we chant to ourselves, we're not going to rip it." Right? He says, that is one part of Shabbos, right? That is certainly a significant detail of Shabbos, not the toilet paper, but that is just the prerequisite for the next step, which is reflection. Why are we here? Our time management skill. What are we doing in this world? Es Shabbos society Shmoru means to say, says the Ksav Vehakabala, you can, if you understand the text, it's not just this is a polemic. Most of what we're learning over here is if you really have a sensitivity to the text, you can understand what the Torah is really telling us, and then appreciate why we're here, which is what it leads to as well. So I hope this has been a little bit of a perspective into this. If you're interested in learning a little more, I would highly advise the most recent edition, which is the Mossad Rav Kook edition, which is a lot more easier. You see, I put a few different prints over here. These are the older prints versions that we were using at the end, which is a little harder in the Rashi font. There's also footnotes over here, which is excellent and in parentheses. And with this now, we can have a renewed perspective of some of the greats who lived in the 19th century. And we'll move next time to the Malbim, Rav Meir Leibush Bezra.